Why would a whole village step off the path when a 19-year-old girl walked toward the well? In the lake country of Oguta, they had an answer ready. Neoma was the cursed child, the orphan the diviner had marked at birth, the one blamed when a net came up empty, when a goat sickened, when the rains came late. Mothers pulled their children close as she passed. She drew her water last, always last, after even the dogs had drunk. She had worn the same string of old carved beads since before she could remember. Beads her aunt was too frightened to take off her. Nobody in Oguta could read them. But those beads were not a curse. They were accounting, each one carved for an ancestor, in an order known to one family alone, the praise string of a chief's true daughter, lost to the lake 19 years ago, and mourned as drowned. At the harvest festival, an old drummer heard those beads click as she carried water past his mat, and his hand froze above the skin. So who was the cursed child, really? And who taught a whole village to fear the very thing that proved her a princess? Count it with me, friend. Before we begin, tell me in the comments. How many years have you carried a name someone else gave you? Dawn on Lake Oguta came in layers. First the gray, then the mist lifting off the water like breath. Then the long canoes sliding out from the reed banks, while the fishermen sang low to keep the rhythm of their paddles. The chiefdom lived by that water and lived on it. Houses stood on stilts along the shore and on the flat green islands that dotted the lake like stepping stones. The people moved by canoe the way other people moved by road. They married across the water, buried across the water, and counted their wealth in nets and fish traps, and the strong sons who could paddle from the first island to the last without resting. Above all of it ruled the Eze Miri, the Lord of the Waters, and for 40 years that title had belonged to Chief Okonkwo of Oguta. He had been a giant of a man once. Now he was a thin shape wrapped in cloth on a carved stool. Watching the lake, he could no longer cross alone. Those old enough loved him, but they spoke of him carefully, the way you speak near a wound that has never closed. They knew the shape of his grief. There had been a daughter, Ugana, his only child, born to the wife he buried young, and she had been the brightness of his old age. They said she could sing the praise of every ancestor in the chief's line without missing a single name, which is no small thing, for that line ran deep as the lake itself. 19 years before this story, Ugana had a daughter of her own. All of Oguta had feasted at the child's naming. The royal drummer had sounded the praise name of the line over the infant. The women had strung her the counting beads that every true daughter of the house received, one carved seed for each ancestor, in the order only the family kept. For one season, the old chief had two brightnesses instead of one. Then the storm came. It came in the season when the lake turns treacherous, when calm water can stand up into walls without warning. Ugana had taken the baby by canoe to the far shrine island to give thanks for the child, as mothers did. They never reached it. The squall caught the little canoe in open water, far from any helping hand, and when the lake grew quiet again, it gave back only the broken hull, and days later, Ugana herself, carried to the reeds as if the water were ashamed of what it had done, the baby it kept. No small body ever came to shore. So the chiefdom mourned a mother and a child together, and the old chief mourned hardest of all. And the diviner, the one man trusted to read the will of the water spirits, stood before the grieving father, and told him the lake had taken the little princess as its own, and that to search further would only anger the deep. The chief, broken, obeyed. The drums that had sounded the child's praise name fell silent for her. And the counting beads, the only thing on this earth that could ever name her, were assumed lost in the dark water, with the body that was never found. Year after year, the old chief grew smaller around that empty place. He had no other heir. When he passed, the stool of the Ezemimiri would go to a council of squabbling cousins, and everyone on the lake knew it, and the knowing made the air around the dying man heavy with quiet calculation. He felt it. He had made his peace with most of it. The single thing he could not make peace with was the not knowing. Whether his granddaughter had died in an instant in the cold, or whether the water had carried her somewhere, to someone, to a life he would never see. What the old chief did not know, what no one in his compound could have guessed, was that the lake had not kept the child at all. It had carried her. Far down the shoreline, past 3 islands, to a reed bank where a poor family found a living infant tangled in a fishing canoe, still wearing a string of carved beads that frightened everyone who looked too closely at them. And 19 years later, that child was drawing her water last at a well that feared her. Reeds. Smoke. The smell of fish drying on racks in the sun. This was the whole world Neoma had been given. On the far shore where the poor of Oguta lived, she had been raised by a woman named Mbike, the wife of the fisherman, who pulled her from the tangled canoe as an infant. The fisherman had died when Neoma was small, and Mbeke had kept the strange foundling out of duty rather than love, because the diviner, Dibia Nwosu, had come the very week the baby was found, and pronounced his verdict over her cradle. The child carried a water curse, he said. The beads at her throat were a dead spirit's claim. Remove them, and the curse would leap to whoever's hand touched the string. Keep her, and misfortune would shadow the house that sheltered her, so Mbeke neither loved the girl nor dared be rid of her. She simply kept her at arm's length for 19 years, the way you keep a thing you are afraid to hold and afraid to throw away. The village took its cue from the diviner. When the fish ran thin, it was the cursed child's shadow on the water. When a baby took fever, someone had seen her pass that morning. She ate alone. She drew water alone after everyone else. Lowering her gourd into a well the others believed she fouled by touching. Children threw pebbles at her back and were not scolded for it. Through all of it, the carved beads stayed at her neck, not because anyone honored them, but because no hand in Oguta would risk the curse it took to remove them. Yet the fear that ruled the village had never managed to take root in the girl herself. Neoma talked to the herons that stood in the shallows at dusk. She left a share of her thin food for an old blind man no one else fed. And when she sang, quietly, only to herself, in the reeds where no one could hear, she sang a strange winding praise. Tune Mbeke had hummed over her cradle in the early years, before the fear hardened, a tune in words neither of them understood. Mbeke had long since stopped humming it. The girl never had. Let me hold the store right here, because of what comes next, and because some of you already know, in your bones, where this is going. If a story about a despised girl who keeps her kindness anyway is the kind of story you want more of, this is the moment to subscribe. It's the one thing that tells me to keep telling them. There. Now let me show you the day the lake tested her. It was a gray, wind-pushed afternoon, and a group of village boys were daring each other along the slick rocks, where the deep channel ran close to shore. The smallest of them was a boy named Obi, quick, laughing, too eager to prove himself to the bigger ones. He leapt for a rock the others had cleared easily, and his foot skated out from under him. And the channel took him the way the lake takes the careless, fast and without a sound. The bigger boys screamed. None of them jumped. The water there was deep and pulling, and not one child on that rock could swim against it. Downstream, filling her gourd, she heard the screaming. She did not stop to think about curses. She went into the channel after him, the cursed girl, the untouchable one, the only person who moved, and she fought the cold pull of the deep until her hands closed on the boy's wrist, and she dragged him, coughing and alive, back onto the reeds. A crowd gathered as the breath came back into him. They looked at the soaked, shaking girl who had saved a village child, and on more than one face you could see the war between gratitude and the fear the diviner had planted years ago. His mother pulled Obi from Neoma's arms without one word of thanks, as if the rescue itself might carry the curse. But the boy looked back at her over his mother's shoulder. This strange girl who had gone into the deep when his own people froze on the rock, and something in him refused to be afraid of her. Wringing the lake from her wrapper, she went back to her gourd and thought no more of it. What she could not know was this: the small boy she'd hauled from the water was the one soul in Oguda who would later cross it for her, when it counted. Once a year, every household on the lake owed hands to the chief's harvest festival. And the cursed girl was exactly the kind of hand a fearful village was glad to send away across the water. Macbeth put her in the canoe with the other servers without a word of warning or farewell. For Neoma, who had never in her life left the far shore, the crossing was its own astonishment. 3 islands sliding past, the great drums of the chief's compound growing louder over the water. More people gathered in one place than she had known the world to hold. She was set to the lowest work at once, as always, carrying gourds of palm wine to the elders' mats, keeping her eyes down, staying at the edges where a cursed girl belonged. The chief's compound that evening was a wall of sound and firelight. Drummers lined one side of the great clearing, and at their center sat the oldest of them, Aziani, who had drummed for the Azi Mimiri since before the chief's own daughter was born. His hands were slower now, but his ear had never dimmed. He could still hear a single offbeat in a wall of 40 drums. He sat half dreaming over his skins, letting the younger men carry the rhythm, when a server passed close behind him with a tray of gourds. He heard the beads before he saw them. It was a small sound, almost nothing under the drumming, the dry click of carved seeds knocking together as the girl moved. But the pattern of it caught in some deep groove of the old man's memory and would not let go. He had strung beads like that with his own hands, long ago. More than that. He knew that a true counting string did not rattle at random. It was carved in weights and sizes that fell, when the wearer walked, into an order, a small repeating music, one ancestor following the next, that a trained ear could read the way a praise singer reads a name, and the order he was hearing was one he knew. Eziani set down his sticks. The younger drummers faltered, glancing at him, but he did not notice them. He rose, an old man rising slowly in a loud and busy place, and he followed the sound, threading through the crowd after a serving girl as if pulled on a string, until he was close enough to see the necklace itself swinging against her worn wrapper in the firelight. He counted under his breath as the beads moved. 1 seed for the founder, 1 for the founder's son, 1 for each name after, in their proper order, down the whole length of the chief's line, the same line Eziani had drummed over a cradle 19 years before, on a night of feasting that had ended 1 season later. In a funeral with no small body to bury, Eziani's legs went weak under him. Girl. His voice cracked on the word. The festival roared on around them, unknowing. But for the old drummer, the whole noisy night had narrowed to one frightened young face and the impossible string at her throat. Girl, stand still. Where did you get those beads? Neoma clutched the tray against herself and braced for the old accusation she had heard her whole life. They're mine, she said. I've worn them always. I didn't steal them, Baba. I swear it. Who carved them? His old hands were shaking now. Do you know what they count? Has anyone ever told you what hangs around your neck? She shook her head, more frightened by his urgency than by any insult. To her the beads had only ever been the mark of her curse, the thing that made her untouchable, the thing her aunt feared to remove. No one had ever once suggested they meant something a man might weep to see, and Eziani was weeping now, this old drummer, in front of the gourds and the firelight, looking at a string of seeds on a cursed servant's neck. "Child," he whispered, "I strung these with these two hands, for a daughter of this house, the night they gave her her name." The drums played on behind them. The festival never paused. But the old man and the frightened girl stood still inside all that noise, and the gap of 19 years began, very quietly, to close. Word that old Eziani was on his feet and weeping over a serving girl moved through the festival faster than the drumming, and a crowd began to gather before he had finished speaking. He did not lower his voice for them. If anything, he raised it, the way a man raises a thing he has waited half a lifetime to say. He took the beads gently in his shaking fingers, the cursed girl flinching, certain she'd be struck, and he turned to the gathering elders and began to count aloud, bead by bead, naming each ancestor of the chief's line as he went. The founder's son, the twin chiefs who divided the lake and made peace again, on down the string, name after name, in an order that matched the praise songs the elders had heard sung at every royal funeral of their lives. By the 10th name, the clearing had gone quiet around them. These were not names a stranger could guess. The counting order of a chief's house was not written anywhere. It lived in the drummers and the praise singers and the memory of the family, passed by mouth and never by ink. A thief might steal a string of pretty beads. A thief could not steal the knowledge of which bead stood for which ancestor, in which place. And yet here was that exact knowledge, carved into seeds, hanging on the neck of a girl the lake had supposedly swallowed 19 years ago. One of the senior elders pushed forward, his face gray. "Stop," he said, though Eziani had already stopped. The old man looked from the beads to the girl's frightened face and back again, and the same arithmetic that had broken the drummer began to work in him. "These are the counting beads of the Ezi Mamiri's own house. They went into the lake with the little princess. Every soul here grew up knowing that." His eyes fixed on Ninoma. "So how do they come to be at the throat of a living girl?" Neoma had no answer. She had spent 19 years being told these beads were her shame, and now grave old men were trembling at the sight of them. And the world had turned so fast she could not find her feet in it. But not every face in that firelit crowd had gone soft with wonder. At the edge of the gathering stood a lean man in the white wrapper and cowrie-strung staff of a diviner, Dibia Nwosu, who had read the will of the water spirits for the chiefdom longer than most could remember. He had been the one, 19 years ago, to stand over a foundling's cradle on the far shore and name the child cursed. He had been the one to tell a grieving chief that searching the lake further would only wake its anger. For 19 years his word on that child had been law, and no one had ever asked him how he came to be on the far shore so quickly, or why he had been so very certain. Now he watched a drummer count those beads aloud, and he understood, before anyone else in that clearing, exactly what their counting threatened to dig up. His face did not crumble. A man does not survive 20 years of speaking for the spirits by letting his face betray him. He composed it instead into grave concern, and he came forward through the parting crowd with his staff clicking its cowries, and he raised one hand for silence, as though the matter were already his to settle. "Hear me," Dibia Nwosu said. "Before this old man's tears carry you all into the water with him." The clearing turned to him. "Out of long habit, you have all known since you were children what these beads are," he went on. "Smooth and certain. They are the dead princess's own. They went down with her into the deep, and now they surface. On the neck of the cursed foundling I warned you of 19 years past. He let his gaze move slowly over the frightened crowd. Ask yourselves what kind of thing wears a drowned child's beads and walks among the living. I did not curse this girl, my people. I only named what the water had already marked, and here it stands before you, daring to call itself your princess. It was a masterstroke, and Naoma felt it land. The very proof that named her had just been turned in front of her eyes into the proof that damned her. Dibia Nwosu's words did what fear always does in a crowd. They spread, and they cooled the wonder that had been rising only a moment before. Heads that had leaned toward the weeping drummer now drew back. People who had crept forward to see the famous beads found reasons to step away from them. The diviner had spent 19 years teaching this chiefdom to dread the cursed foundling, and that teaching did not undo itself in one firelit evening, however many ancestors an old man could count. Mutters moved through the gathering. A few of the women made the old sign against evil water spirits, and more than one pair of eyes went to Neneoma with the look you give a thing that should have stayed at the bottom of the lake. But Eziani would not be moved, and an old man with nothing left to lose is harder to silence than a young one. You read the spirits, Nwosu, he said, turning on the diviner with a steadiness that surprised the crowd. I read drums, and I am telling you, telling all of you, that no curse on this earth carves a true counting string in the right order. Spirits do not know the order of a chief's ancestors. Only the living blood of the house knows it, and the hands that serve that house. I am one of those hands. I strung these beads for Ugana's daughter the night of her naming, and what I strung, I would know in the dark. His certainty pulled the wonder back just a little, and into that opening came another voice, older even than Eziani's, dry as reed paper. Carried to the festival, as he was every year, the senior keeper of the chief's traditions was too frail to stand. Now the old keeper asked to see the string. They brought the girl to him through the parted crowd, and he ran his blind fingers slowly along the beads, counting by touch the way Eziani had counted by ear, his lips moving over each name. When he reached the end, he sat silent for a long moment. The order is true, he said simply, down to the last seed. This is the counting of the Ezi Mamiri's house, and it has not been seen since the night the lake took the child. That should have settled it. Among the lake people, the word of the blind keeper on a matter of lineage was as close to law as a living voice could be. But Dibia Nwosu had not built his power on losing such moments, and he leaned now on the one thing stronger in that chiefdom than any keeper's word: the people's fear of the water that fed and drowned them in equal measure. No one doubts the beads are real, the diviner said smoothly. I doubt the thing wearing them. The lake took the princess. We buried her mother. You would have me believe the deep simply handed a royal child to a stranger's canoe and let her live? Either she is the princess returned, or she is what the water sent back in the princess's place. And in all my years of reading the spirits, my people, the water has never once returned a gift without taking a price. It was clever, and it was cruel, and it worked on exactly the fear he had spent 2 decades feeding. What none of them could see was the truth turning quietly under the diviner's calm. The reason his certainty ran so deep. 19 years ago, Dibia Nwosu had not simply read the lake's will. He had reached the far shore the morning after the storm not by chance, but because he had business there. He had never confessed, and what he had done, or failed to do, on the night that canoe went into the water, was a thing he had buried beneath 19 years of other men's fear. A returned princess might remember nothing. But the people who had helped him bury the truth were not all dead, and a girl who could prove her blood could also, in time, prove what had really happened to her mother. So the elders reached the only ruling that fear and proof together allowed. The beads were true, that the keeper had settled. But the final word of the house was not in its beads. It was in its drum. The praise name of the line sounded over every true child and known in full to one living man. Bring that name, and the matter ended. That man was Eziani, and by the next morning, the old drummer could not be woken. Eziani's sickness had a name, though no one dared say it aloud, and the name was Dibia Nwosu. The old drummer had gone to his mat, strong enough to argue with the diviner before the whole festival, and woke unable to lift his head, his speech thick, his eyes wandering. People whispered that the curse had reached for the one who defended the cursed girl, which was precisely the story the diviner wanted them to whisper. A man who reads the spirits knows which leaves bring sleep and which bring the kind of stillness that looks like a spirit's hand. Whether Eziani had been given something or only frightened into collapse by a threat made in the dark, no one could prove. What mattered was that the one living man who could sound the praise name of the line now lay senseless behind a curtain and might never speak clearly again. That left the second proof, and the diviner moved against it just as fast. For the praise name was not the only record of the lost princess. On the night of a royal naming, it was the custom of the lake people to carve the event into a paddle blade. The date by the moon, the mother's name, the count of the beads strung for the child. That carved paddle was kept in the shrine of the chief's ancestors on the small sacred island at the center of the lake, and the keeper of that shrine, by long arrangement, was the diviner himself. So, when the elders sent 2 men by canoe to fetch the naming paddle of Ugana's daughter, they found the shrine swept and the paddle gone. Dibia Nwosu spread his hands and grieved that the ancestors must have reclaimed it, as they sometimes did. No one could say otherwise. The 2 proofs that could have ended the matter in a single evening, the name in a dying man's memory, the record in a vanished paddle, had both slipped into the dark within a day of each other, and the only thread connecting them was a man in a white wrapper whom no one in Oguta had ever dared to question. Neoma felt the trap close around her, even though she did not yet understand its shape. She had been kept at the chief's compound while the elders argued her fate, neither prisoner nor guest, watched by people who did not know whether to bow to her or bar their doors against her. By the second day, the mood had curdled. The wonder of the beads was fading. The fear the diviner fed was growing back like weed over a cleared path. She could feel the chiefdom deciding, slowly, to send the trouble back across the water and forget it had ever crossed. What she did not expect was a small voice at the reed fence after dark. It was Obi, the boy she had pulled from the channel, who had crossed 3 islands by canoe, to follow the only person who had ever risked anything for him. A child draws no suspicion at a festival. He had gone where Neoma could not, slipped where the elders' messengers were watched, and he had heard the thing the grown men missed. That on the night the naming paddle vanished, a fisherman had seen the diviner's own canoe leaving the shrine island before dawn, riding low, as though it carried more than one man. He didn't take it to the spirits, Obi whispered through the reeds. He hid it. I heard where. Neoma crouched to the boy's level, her heart loud. Where? The old fish-smoking hut on the empty island. Nobody goes there. My uncle saw the canoe. The boy's eyes were fierce in the dark. You went into the water for me. I can go across it for you. Quick as the boy was, she caught his thin shoulder before he could dart off. The same lake that had drowned a princess and a mother 19 years ago lay black and wide between them and that island. And she would not send a child across it alone in the night to steal back the one proof a powerful man had killed an old drummer's voice to bury. But she also knew this. By the time the elders made their ruling, the trouble they wanted gone would be gone, and the paddle with it. So she did not send Obi across the water. She went with him, while a cursed girl and a small boy pushed a canoe into the black water. The diviner was busy on dry land, and his target was the one man whose word could end everything before the paddle ever surfaced. Chief Okonkwo had a younger brother named Ikenna, who carried the burdens the dying chief no longer could. He was a careful, proud man who loved the house and feared its shame more than he feared the lake itself. With his brother failing and the stool soon to be empty, Ikenna had no patience for a festival day scandal that set the whole chiefdom whispering. The diviner knew that impatience, and he poured into it exactly what it was thirsting to hear. Dibia Nwosu did not call the girl a liar. He called her a danger. "Your brother's heart is weak," he told Ikenna quietly, away from the crowd. "Picture what it does to him if you parade this foundling before him as his blood. And the spirits take their price, and he dies believing a cursed thing now sits in his line. The whole lake is already murmuring. If you let this drag on, Oguta will say the house of the Ezemimiri lost its head over a drowned girl's beads. Send her back across the water tonight. Let the festival close clean. Protect your brother's name while he still has breath to keep it." Every word was aimed at the thing Ikenna loved, the family's standing, and not one of them was quite a lie. By the gray of early morning, Ikenna had made his decision the way a tired man makes the easy one. The girl's claim would not be heard. Beads or no beads, drummer or no drummer, she would be put back in a canoe at first light and returned to the far shore, and the matter would be closed before his brother woke to hope and be broken by it. He told himself he was being merciful. He was only being afraid. The order went out to find the cursed girl and hold her for the dawn crossing. But the cursed girl was not in the compound. Her sleeping mat was empty and cold, and no one had seen her since dusk. And in the confusion of a festival winding down, no one could say how a watched and friendless foundling had simply vanished into the night. Ikenna's men searched the shore. The diviner, hearing she was gone, felt the first cold finger of unease since the old drummer had started counting. Because there was only one place on the whole lake a desperate girl might row to in the dark. And out on the black water, two small figures were already nearing the empty island, where a stolen paddle waited in a forgotten hut. Dawn found the whole compound in an uproar. The cursed girl gone, the chief's brother shouting for canoes, and then, out of the mist on the water, a small craft came back to the landing with two soaked figures in it, and a carved paddle laid across the girl's knees like an offering. Ikenna's men seized her the moment she stepped ashore. She did not fight them. She only held the paddle high above their grasping hands and called out in a voice that carried across the stunned crowd that this was the naming record of Ugana's daughter, taken from where the diviner had hidden it, and that the elders had sworn to hear the truth, and now they would. They brought her before the chief's stool, because the noise had reached even the dying man, and he had asked to be carried out into the morning to see for himself. What followed, the elders would retell for the rest of their lives. Neoma laid the wet paddle before them, and let the blind keeper's grandson read aloud what was carved into the blade. The moon and season of a naming 19 years past, the name of the mother, Ugana, and the count of the beads strung for her child, bead by bead, in the exact order Eziani had sounded, and the keeper had confirmed. The carving and the necklace agreed down to the last seed. One record in wood, one in carved beads, made on the same night by the same hands, matching across 19 years, and the width of a lake that should have swallowed them both. Then Neoma did the thing no one had told her she could do. She had spent her life believing she knew nothing of where she came from. But there was one thing she had always carried and never understood. The winding tune Mcbeck had hummed over her cradle before the fear set in, the lullaby in words that meant nothing to either of them. Standing before the chief's stool, frightened and dripping lake water, she began, softly, to sing it. The clearing went still in a way the diviner's fear had never managed, for it was no lullaby. The elders knew it by the third phrase, and the old keeper lifted his head, and even the dying chief's wandering eyes came suddenly clear, because the girl was singing the drum praise name of the Asa Mamiri's line. The Oja song sounded over each true child of the house, and never, ever taught outside the blood. Mcbeck had hummed it to a foundling for years without once knowing what it was. A frightened young mother, drowning in a storm 19 years past, must have sung it over her baby until the very last, and the baby had kept it the way she had kept the beads, without knowing it named her. The chief began to weep where he sat. Dibya Nwosu felt the ground shifting and lunged for the only footing he had left. "Trickery," he said, his smooth voice climbing. "The drummer taught her the song before he fell ill, to deceive you all." "That drummer cannot speak," the blind keeper said quietly. "You saw to that, and no man teaches in one evening a song it takes a child of the house a lifetime to carry true." He turned his sightless face toward the diviner. "But you raise a fair question, Nwosu. Let us all ask how you came to be on the far shore the very morning after the storm, before any word could have reached you, to declare a living child cursed." The clearing turned, slow and cold, toward the man in the white wrapper. And there it was, the thread the counting had threatened to pull from the first. A fisherman, prompted, remembered, ferrying the diviner across that night, before the storm, toward the shrine island where Ugana's canoe was bound. Another recalled the diviner's old debt to a rival who had wanted no royal heir at all. Peace met peace in the morning light. A man who had reasons of his own to see that canoe fail to reach safe water, who had reached the far shore not by the spirit's guidance, but by his own paddle, and who had buried his part beneath 19 years of a curse he invented to keep every eye turned away from the child who might one day remember. He had no story left that the facts would hold. His eyes moved from the weeping chief to the matching paddle to the girl whose song had named him Undone, and the cowrie staff that had ruled a chiefdom for 20 years hung useless in his hand. A name spoken before a crowd is one thing. A name sealed before the ancestors is another, and the lake people knew the difference. They held the rite 3 days later, when the water was calm enough to trust, on the sacred shrine island at the center of Oguta, the very island Ugana had been rowing toward the night the storm took her. The whole chiefdom came by canoe, a slow fleet of them crossing the bright water, until the little island was ringed with boats, and the drums could be heard from every shore. The blind keeper presided. He called the ancestors by name, the same names carved in the beads and the paddle, and asked them to look upon the daughter the lake had carried away and carried home. Then the drummers sounded the praise name of the line over her. Not a frightened girl's whisper now, but the full voice of the great drums, the Oja song rolling across the water the way it had rolled over her cradle 19 years before. The old chief laid his trembling hand on her head and gave her back the name her mother had chosen, Chidiogo. God has shown mercy. The cursed child of the far shore was gone. In her place stood the acknowledged daughter of the house of the Ezemiri, and the people who had once pulled their children from her path now knelt on the wet ground before her. But before a single chief's ornament was laid on her, Chidiogo asked the drums to stop. She walked first not to the stool, but to the edge of the water, to the place the lake met the shrine island. and she knelt there in the mud and spoke quietly to her mother, who had drowned within sight of this shore, trying to bring her child to give thanks. She thanked Ugana for the song. She thanked her for holding the beads on a baby's neck even as the water took her. Whatever strength had let a dying woman sing a praise name to her infant in a sinking canoe, it had reached across 19 years to name her at last. Then she rose and did what no one expected of a new princess. She sent a canoe to bring old Eziani, weak but waking, to sit in the place of honor beside the stool, the drummer whose ear had known her, and whose voice the diviner had tried to still. And she drew the boy Obi out of the crowd, the child who had crossed the black water at her side, and named him kin before the whole chiefdom, so that no one in Oguta would ever again call his courage small. The old chief watched his granddaughter lift the lowly before she lifted herself, and his failing eyes turned, at last, toward the man in the white wrapper. The chief's judgment, when it came, was quiet, but quiet from the Eze Mimiri carried farther than another man's shout. Dibia Nunwosu had ruled Oguta through fear of the water for 20 years, and it was the water that undid him. Pressed before the elders, the fisherman who had ferried him told all of it, how the diviner had paid to be rowed toward the shrine island the very evening Ugana set out, how he had a quarrel with the chief's house and a debt to a rival who wanted no heir born, and how he had returned at dawn to call a surviving child cursed so that no one would ever ask why he had been on that water at all. He had not raised the storm, no man can. But he had let a mother and child row into it knowing, and he had buried his silence under 19 years of other people's dread. The chiefdom stripped him of his staff and his shrine. The cowries that had made villagers tremble were cut from his wrapper before the crowd, and the white cloth of his office taken from his shoulders. No spirit spoke to defend him. There had never been a spirit, only a frightened, greedy man. He was sent from Oguta to live on a far bank where no one knew his name to fear it. The Lord of Curses, ending his days as a man whose word meant nothing at all. Mabik faced a smaller reckoning, and a different one. She came trembling to the shrine island, certain the new princess would repay 19 cold years in kind. She had not been cruel, only afraid, and her fear had let a child grow up unloved. Chidiogo looked at the woman who had fed her without ever once holding her, and did not raise her voice. In the end, she let Mabi keep her small house, and sent her home with grain enough for the season, and with that mercy laid a weight on her heavier than any punishment. The knowledge of the daughter she might have had she chosen love over fear. Each of them received, in the end, the exact measure of what they had given. Chief Okonkwo lived to see one more dry season, long enough to teach his granddaughter the names in the beads himself, his old finger moving seed by seed while she repeated each ancestor after him. When the lake finally called him home, Chidiogo took up the stool of the Eze Mimiri, and the lake country learned what kind of ruler a despised child becomes when she remembers every cold morning of it. No one in Oguta was ever again named cursed by the word of one frightened man. She forbade it, and built a place on the shrine island where any child the villages turned away could be brought instead of shunned. The well that had served her last now served the orphan first, and each year at the harvest, the great drums sounded the praise name of the line over every new child of the chiefdom, not in secret, the way it had once been hoarded, but in the open, so that no daughter of the lake would ever again carry her own name without knowing it. Obi grew tall in the chief's compound and became, in time, the keeper of her canoes. The boy who crossed the black water for her, trusted at last with every crossing. Old Eziani lived to drum at her side for years, and never once let the chiefdom forget that it was a string of beads, clicking in the dark, that had called a lost daughter home, And the song? The winding praise tune a drowning mother sang to her baby, that a frightened ant hummed without understanding, that a cursed girl carried 19 years without knowing what it named. That song was never hoarded again. The elders tell it this way, by the fire. When the lamps burn low, the lake may hide a thing for a season, but still water keeps no secret forever. What is true will float, what is buried will rise, and the deep, in its own slow time, gives back what was never truly its own. So before you go, let me leave you with this. A whole village looked at the proof of who Chidiogo was, and called it a curse. How many people, do you think, have been thrown away by the world for the very thing that made them precious? Tell me below. I read every word you write, and if this story moved you, do one thing tonight: follow. And let the next tale find you when the fire is lit again.